So today we're talking about as above, so below. A great concept that helps you understand your reality and how the really small things really relate to the really big things. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Fibonacci sequence, but it can be found in flowers, in the shell of, and even in clusters of stars and the way, galaxies look. That spiral shape. It's the Fibonacci sequence. Those same mathematical principles govern the growth of a tree branch and the formation of galaxies. The branching of patterns of trees, lightning bolts, rivers, blood vessels, all resemble fractal geometry. These patterns really repeat themselves through different scales, small and big. So I want to dive into how as above, so below, seeing these patterns and fractals helps you, just gives you like a cheat code into life. Look, everywhere you look, the universe is trying to just copy paste its designs. A lot of things look very similar to other things, and there's a lot of good reason for that. It's efficient. Nature definitely wants to be efficient and do things in ways that make sense, that can be repeated in many different ways. So you'll see that blueprint of nature all over the place, almost in anything that's naturally occurring. It's what we sometimes call universal symmetry. So when we take a closer look at atoms and galaxies, even though they seem like they're worlds apart, they're super different. You think about an atom, it's just like the nuclei, and then those particles are going around it. Think about the galaxy, it's the same situation where you have the planets orbiting the sun. It's the same dynamic that we're dealing with here, even though one is more of a electromagnetic situation, and then the other is a more of a gravitational situation. Again, similar structure. There's a central core in orbiting bodies. This is a common pattern of organization where these systems are held together by forces that create balance and order. What we're seeing is a phenomenon of unity in diversity. This is just to really remind you that even though the universe has so much complexity in it, it's still governed by a few overriding principles that repeat across scales. So, really small and really big. I like to refer to this as nature's control C and control V, right? The reason I think about it like that is just that copy and paste thing that's happening all around us. Nature is the master of replication. From something that's microscopic to something that's huge, like a huge mountain or something like that, you see this blueprint and structure built through nature. These same patterns keep showing up. Let's get back to the trees and the blood vessels. So both trees' branches and our blood vessels and veins, our circulatory system, they are using the same structure. And why do they use that same structure? It's simple, just to optimize flow and get resources where they need to be. You see this with a river or a stream, same situation. How is the flow optimized? Same patterns, big and very small, into like our veins and our arms and stuff. You also see this with when things go viral on social media. Very interesting dynamic. It's almost like when something just is all over the place and it can't be controlled anymore, like a deer overpopulating like a forest, super out of control, or infestation of something. Very similar mechanisms at play here. Let's talk about how to hack this above and below dynamic. It's actually really called the principle or law of correspondence. There's a couple ways you can hack the principles and laws of correspondence. I love to talk about utility of things. So let's talk about zooming in and zooming out. So when you're stuck on a problem, try to zoom out to see what are the patterns that you can identify with. And then you want to zoom back in to try to figure out what are the details. So you want to shift your perspective to what's the big picture and what are the minor details. For instance, you might see a traffic jam as a system-wide issue. For instance, there's just poor infrastructure in the city and they just haven't done anything about it. Or there's terrible road closures and things like that that haven't been resolved. And when you zoom in, you can actually see like maybe there's certain bottlenecks in the city that cause all the traffic. So when you zoom out, you want to think about what are the bigger or larger patterns at play in this situation. And when you zoom in, you want to think about what are these small details or what small changes could have a really big impact. Great innovations really or often rise from connecting totally unrelated ideas together. Believe it or not, this is a direct application of the law of correspondence, as above, so below. Let me explain. So, patterns in one area, in one idea, in one domain, in one industry can inspire innovation in another. You always want to be looking for patterns and things that can be applied to other situations. I remember reading about the Wright brothers and how all these different people were trying to solve the problem of flight. No one could ever fly for more than a couple seconds without just crashing out. It was bad. So the Wright brothers talked about going to different air shows where military, different contractors, all these different super well-funded companies were trying to build aircrafts. And they were failing over and over because they were coming from a mindset that was within the industry of mechanics and big industrial machines like ships and trains and all those things. They thought brute force is what would get us into the air. But the Wright brothers, they are coming from a different industry. They are coming from the bike industry, where it's not the big, heaviest, most powerful tool, which is the best bike. It's actually the most lightweight, the most aerodynamic, finding the likelihood to just glide through air. These guys were trying to launch tanks into the air because it had thrust. No, you need something light. And they were bike makers. So that's how they came up with the airplane. They had to come from a different industry with a different idea. So when you see connections between two different things, it can really spark innovation and creativity. And by aligning your life or the things that you try to innovate with, or when you try to solve problems, if you align that with the law of correspondence and look for these patterns in different ways, you can work smarter, not harder. So you want to observe patterns like in nature and see how that reflects in your own life. How does this issue or problem, or how does this mirror the entire system? What patterns can I borrow from nature to help me to solve this? And it's okay to use AI, visualization tools, or just sketch out or map out all these different patterns and connections. Now, with the law of correspondence, there are limitations. Not every piece of the universe fits into its grand design. There are moments where that pattern breaks. The worldly patterns we observe in large systems tend to break down sometimes. Honestly, quantum mechanics reveals a world that is problematic, counterintuitive, and really unpredictable at times. I don't know if this is a word, but it's like quantum weirdness, where it reminds us that not everything can be explained with this neat repeating pattern. We have to understand that there are fundamental limits to our understanding. And the universe operates in ways that can be or seem chaotic or just random. Now, there is a thing called cultural bias, and I'm going to explain it in a little bit of a different way, but it should hit home with if you already know what cultural bias is. So we have a tendency to impose our own patterns and meanings onto the world, even when they don't exist. This can really lead to oversimplification of things, superstition, and misinterpretation. You got to be careful about forcing what you believe is a pattern into other parts of your life or into daily things that have nothing to do with you. You have to be careful about that. You don't want to force nature's blueprint onto inherently like human matters like personality, relationships, or decisions that have to do with stuff like that. If you're not careful, you can end up with flawed conclusions. Remember, it's a lens, not a rule book. Use the law of correspondence as a guide, not an absolute truth. Mark Twain once said, "History never repeats itself, but it rhymes." Let's talk about how to just apply the law of correspondence in your everyday life. You want to stay curious, use the law of correspondence as a starting point for exploration. Be open to exceptions and surprises. Don't force patterns into situations. You got to ask yourself, is this pattern actually real or am I imposing it? I think it's also important to understand that breaks in patterns can lead to innovation, creativity, and new ways of thinking. Once you really learn to see these connections, you will definitely rewire your reality. You'll realize that life isn't just random chaos, and it's like a beautiful symphony of some recurring notes and different motifs just waiting for us to decode them.